Have you ever wondered how a man who could outrun the fastest defenders in the world ended up trapped behind cold steel bars? Imagine a player so electric that the mere mention of his name made the crowds in Georgia roar with a feverish intensity. He was the golden boy of the 1970s, a two-time All-Star who possessed a speed that seemed almost supernatural. But tonight, we are peeling back the curtain on a story the league tried to bury for decades. This is the tragic, scandalous, and ultimately shocking investigation into the life of Eddie Johnson, the man they called Fast Eddie. From the heights of professional glory to the absolute bottom of a prison cell, his journey is a haunting reminder that the brightest lights often cast the darkest shadows. Why did the league turn its back on him? What really happened in those smoky locker rooms and high-stakes back rooms? Get ready, because the truth about Eddie Johnson is far more disturbing than any headline you have ever read. The 1970s were a time of feathered hair, disco lights, and a brand of basketball that was raw, fast, and dangerous. In the middle of it all stood Eddie Johnson, a man whose physical gifts were so immense they seemed like a biological miracle. According to the official league protocols from the 1980 and 1981 seasons, Eddie Johnson didn't just play in the All-Star games, he dominated the conversation about the future of the sport. Journalists from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution wrote in their archives that his speed was not just a skill, it was a weapon that terrified every opponent who stepped onto the hardwood. He was the face of a franchise, a hero to thousands, and a man who seemingly had the world at his feet. But as we dig deeper into the investigative files of that era, a different picture begins to emerge. While the fans were cheering for every lightning-fast layup, a shadow was growing behind the scenes. It appeared in the subtle shifts of his behavior and the whispers among the coaching staff that something was terribly wrong. In various media reports from the early 80s, insiders began to hint that the man who could outrun anyone was actually running toward a cliff. The league, desperate to protect its image during a fragile era, kept the growing crisis under wraps, hoping their star would simply find his way back to the light. The question that haunts historians today is simple. How much did the authorities actually know while they were selling tickets to his performances? The tragedy of Eddie Johnson was already in motion, fueled by a secret that was about to explode. But even as the cheers echoed through the arena, there was a hidden ledger, a set of numbers that would eventually force everyone to face a reality they weren't prepared for. Behind the glitz of the All-Star weekend, a financial trail was forming that suggested Fast Eddie was already paying a heavy price for a lifestyle the public couldn't even imagine. The date was June 10, 1977, a day that was supposed to change the destiny of basketball in Georgia forever. The Atlanta Hawks held the 4th overall pick in the draft, and they knew exactly who they wanted. When they called the name of Eddie Johnson, the room erupted. He wasn't just a draft pick, he was a messiah in sneakers. According to the official draft protocols of 1977, the expectations placed on this young man from Auburn were sky high. He was signed to a contract that, for the time, was considered a fortune. Financial reports from the club's archives suggest that his initial deal included figures that would have made any young man's head spin, providing him with an immediate entry into the world of the elite. However, looking back at the documents from that period, we see the first signs of the investigative anchors that would later define his downfall. While his peers were investing in businesses and homes, reports from bank associates at the time began to show unusual cash withdrawals and spending patterns that didn't align with a typical athlete's portfolio. In several interviews conducted with former teammates years later, it was noted that Eddie Johnson seemed to have an endless supply of new friends who were more interested in his wallet than his jumper. The thrill of being the 4th pick brought with it a level of pressure and temptation that few 22-year-olds could navigate. This leads us to a disturbing realization. The very moment of his greatest triumph was also the moment the trap began to close. While the Hawks management was busy planning their championship run around their new star, the records indicate that Eddie Johnson was already being pulled into a world of high-stakes risks and questionable associations. He was the hope of a city, but that hope was built on a foundation that was already beginning to crack under the weight of sudden wealth. And as the season began, those cracks were hidden by his brilliance on the court. But one specific set of expenses in his private records was about to signal that the taxes on a luxurious life were actually something far more sinister. To understand why the fall of Eddie Johnson was so devastating, you have to understand just how good he was on the court. During the 1979 to 1980 season, he was an absolute force of nature. Statistics from that year show that he averaged 19.1 points per game, a number that placed him among the elite guards of the league. In an iconic article from Sports Illustrated at the time, the author described his physical superiority as unmatched, claiming that defenders felt like they were trying to catch a ghost. He wasn't just scoring, he was demoralizing the opposition with a combination of grace and raw power that defined the era of the Atlanta Hawks. But as our investigation into the locker room atmosphere of the early 80s reveals, the documentary beats of his life were becoming increasingly erratic. In the reports of sports journalists who traveled with the team, it was often noted that Eddie Johnson would arrive for morning shoot-arounds looking completely drained, his eyes bloodshot, and his focus elsewhere. Despite this, he would step onto the floor and perform miracles, leading many to wonder how he could maintain such a high level of play while clearly struggling in his private hours. The statistics were glowing, but the human being behind the numbers was beginning to fade. The investigative question here is chilling. Was his incredible speed on the court a way of trying to outrun the toxic habits that were taking over his life? In various public materials and memoirs from staff members, it is suggested that the management was willing to overlook his eccentricities as long as he kept putting up those 19.1 points per game. They saw a superstar, but they ignored the man who was slowly losing his grip on reality. The adulation of the fans served as a mask, hiding a deteriorating situation that was destined to end in a courtroom rather than a Hall of Fame induction. But as the 1980 season reached its peak, the mask began to slip during a road trip that would change everything, leaving the team to wonder who or what was really riding the bus with them. The Omni Coliseum was the beating heart of Atlanta sports, a place where legends were born under the glare of 1,000 lights. But for Eddie Johnson, the real action started only after the final buzzer echoed through the rafters. Atlanta in the late 1970s was a city of neon and temptation, a playground where a young man with a pocket full of cash could easily lose his way. According to investigative materials and court testimony that surfaced years later, Eddie Johnson became a fixture in the city's most notorious late-night establishments. These weren't just places to celebrate a victory, they were the venues where his hard-earned thousands began to disappear into the pockets of shadows. In police reports from that era, the cost of certain forbidden underground habits in Georgia was staggering, with some estimates suggesting that a single evening of entertainment could cost a professional athlete upwards of several $1,000s. In several documentary bits found in archival court records, witnesses described seeing the Star Guard in the company of individuals who had no business being near a professional locker room. These weren't fans or teammates. They were the architects of his eventual destruction. Why would a man who had worked so hard to escape the struggles of his youth risk it all for a few hours of artificial euphoria? The investigation into his finances at the time reveals a terrifying pattern of withdrawals that simply didn't add up for a man of his stature. It was as if he were trying to set fire to his own success. While the public saw a hero, the private documents tell a story of a man being systematically dismantled by his own choices and the company he kept in those smoky, dimly lit backrooms of the city. The most chilling piece of evidence comes from a later interview with a known underworld figure who claimed that Eddie Johnson was spending more on his secret habits in 1 week than the average Georgian family earned in an entire year. And just as this financial spiral was reaching its breaking point, the 1980 season arrived, bringing with it a level of fame that would make hiding his double life almost impossible. The year 1980 should have been the crowning achievement of Eddie Johnson's life. On February 3, 1980, he stepped onto the court for the All-Star Game, solidified as one of the premier talents in the entire league. The official protocol from that night lists him alongside the greatest names to ever play the game, a testament to a skill set that was truly world-class. To the outside world, he was untouchable, a god in a Hawks jersey who could fly past any defender. But behind the scenes, the trash-under-the-rug policy of the franchise was starting to fail. Internal club documents and memoirs from former Hawks staff members reveal that the 1979 to 1980 season was plagued by Eddie Johnson's unexplained absences and a string of fines for what was officially called persistent tardiness. In the investigative files of the team's front office, these fines were not just small slap-on-the-wrist penalties. We are talking about thousands of dollars in sanctioned deductions that were kept strictly out of the headlines to protect the team's gate receipts. There were reports of him missing flights and showing up to practices in a state that could only be described as deeply concerning. Yet, because he was still producing elite numbers on the court, the management chose to look the other way, effectively enabling a disaster that was growing by the day. This raises a haunting question. If the league had stepped in during that peak year of 1980, could the tragedy have been averted? Or was the momentum of his downfall already too great to stop? While the fans were buying jerseys with his number, the office of the commissioner was beginning to receive whispers that couldn't be ignored. A folder with the name Eddie Johnson was being compiled, and it wasn't filled with highlights. It was filled with evidence of a man who believed the rules of gravity and the law no longer applied to him. To understand the man, you have to understand the hunger that drove him. Born into the heat of Florida, Eddie Johnson's early life was defined by a desperate need to outrun the shadow of poverty. Records from the Auburn University archives paint a picture of a young athlete who was hyper-competitive, almost to a fault. In various public materials and rare interviews he gave during his college years, he often spoke about a never-ending search for adrenaline, a physiological need to be moving faster than everyone else just to feel alive. This wasn't just about basketball. It was a deep-seated psychological drive that made the slow, mundane parts of life feel unbearable. When the millions of dollars started flowing in, that search for adrenaline moved from the hardwood to the dark corners of the night. Psychologists who have studied the patterns of high-performance athletes often point to this speed as a double-edged sword. For Eddie Johnson, the same fire that made him a nightmare for defenders was the very thing that consumed him when the lights went out. In several documentary bits from his time in Atlanta, teammates recalled that he seemed unable to sit still, always looking for the next thrill, the next high-stakes game, the next forbidden escape. He wasn't just playing basketball, he was trying to outpace a ghost from his past that told him it could all be taken away in an instant. This scarcity mindset led him to make reckless decisions, believing that if he didn't live at 100 miles per hour, he wasn't living at all. But as any investigator will tell you, you can't run at that speed forever without something breaking. By the early 80s, his behavior had become so erratic that it was no longer a secret known only to his inner circle. He thought he was in total control of his life until one evening after a grueling practice, a man in a dark suit approached him with an official notice that would change his life forever. The year 1982 was a turning point that sent shockwaves through the entire sports world as the Golden Boy of Atlanta finally faced the music. Up until that moment, many fans believed that Eddie Johnson was simply a wild child of the era, a man who played hard and partied harder. But when the official press release from the league office landed on the desks of journalists in early 1982, the tone changed instantly. According to that historic document, the Star Guard was being suspended indefinitely for what was described as conduct detrimental to the league and repeated failures to adhere to the health protocols of the time. The investigation reveals that this wasn't just a minor disciplinary slap. This was an earthquake. In the archives of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, reporters noted that the city was in a state of mourning, unable to believe that their Fast Eddie was caught in such a web of trouble. The documentary beats of this chapter are found in the staggering number of games he was forced to miss that season. While his teammates were fighting for a playoff spot, Eddie Johnson was sidelined for a significant portion of the schedule, watching his career earnings evaporate through heavy league fines. Public materials from that period suggest that the Hawks management was desperate, trying to find a way to reconcile his immense talent with his increasingly unpredictable nature. The question that investigators still ask today is, did this public shaming serve as a wake-up call, or was it the final push that sent him deeper into the shadows? In the transcripts of press conferences from 1982, Coach Kevin Lockery tried to remain optimistic, but the look in his eyes told a different story. The league had officially drawn a line in the sand, and for the first time, the man who could outrun any defender found himself cornered by the very rules he thought he could ignore. But even as the suspension served as a public warning, a darker reality was unfolding behind the closed doors of expensive medical facilities. While the fans hoped for a triumphant return, those who saw the bills for his specialized treatment knew that the cost of saving Eddie Johnson was going to be higher than anyone could have ever predicted. By the mid-'80s, the league and the Atlanta Hawks were no longer just managing a basketball player. They were managing a crisis. In an effort to protect their investment, they funneled Eddie Johnson into some of the most prestigious recovery programs in the country. According to various investigative reports and coaching memoirs from that era, the cost of these private wellness retreats in the early to mid-'80s could easily exceed tens of thousands of dollars per month. These were significant sums, especially when you consider the value of a dollar back then. The documentary trail shows that the league was desperate for a success story, wanting to prove that their new Get Tough policy could actually help men like Eddie Johnson overcome their harmful dependencies. However, the records from those clinics, often cited in later legal proceedings, suggest a man who was only going through the motions. Medical experts of the time, whose testimonies were later summarized in sports media archives, pointed out that the methods used in the 1980s were often ill-equipped to handle the unique pressures of professional superstardom. While the official reports sent back to the team owners spoke of incremental progress and renewed focus, those who were actually in the trenches with him saw something else. In various interviews, it was revealed that Eddie Johnson would often leave these facilities and immediately seek out the very distractions that had landed him there in the first place. The yoke of expectation was simply too heavy. This creates a haunting suspicion. Was the entire rehabilitation process just an expensive fiction designed to keep the ticket sales moving? Or was he truly beyond the help of the science available in 1984? While the doctors were signing his release papers, claiming he was ready for a fresh start, the investigators found that Eddie Johnson was already looking for an exit strategy. And that exit would lead him away from the city that loved him, straight into the cold, gray reality of a final, desperate trade to a team that didn't know the monster they were inviting into their locker room. In a move that many saw as a last-ditch effort to salvage his career, the Atlanta Hawks finally parted ways with their troubled star, trading him to the Cleveland Cavaliers. The trade logs from the mid-'80s show that this transaction was less about basketball strategy and more about clearing the air in the Atlanta locker room. When Eddie Johnson arrived in Ohio, the expectations were muted, but there was still a flickering hope that a change of scenery could work a miracle. However, the statistics from the 1985 to 1986 season tell a much bleaker story. According to the official team records, he managed to appear in only 15 games for the Cavaliers. It was a pathetic shadow of the man who had once dominated the All-Star stage just 5 years earlier. The documentary beats of his time in Cleveland are filled with reports of missed practices and a physical condition that shocked his new teammates. In various investigative articles from the Cleveland Plain Dealer, insiders described a man who seemed to have aged 20 years in a single season. The fast Eddie who could sprint the length of the court in seconds was gone, replaced by a player whose feet felt like they were made of lead. His 15-game stint in a Cavaliers jersey resulted in a career-low average that made it clear to everyone in the league that the end was near. It was reported that during one particular road trip, his teammates found his gear thrown into the hallway, a silent, brutal message that his presence was no longer tolerated. The dream was dead, and the numbers on his final paychecks from the club reflected a catastrophic decline in value. But even as the Cavaliers prepared to cut ties with him, the highest office in the league was preparing a final judgment. The commissioner had seen enough of the 15-game failures and the broken promises. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would result in a punishment so severe it would forever change the history of professional sports in America. By the mid-1980s, the landscape of professional basketball was undergoing a seismic shift. A new sheriff had arrived in the form of Commissioner David Stern, and he was determined to scrub the league's tarnished image until it sparkled. In the official transcripts of league meetings from 1983, it was documented that the NBA had implemented a groundbreaking anti-drug agreement, the first of its kind in major American sports. This wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a weapon designed to eliminate the harmful habits that were devouring stars like Eddie Johnson. David Stern's public statements, archived in various sports media reports from that era, made it crystal clear that the era of looking the other way was over. The policy of zero tolerance was born, and Eddie Johnson was squarely in the crosshairs of this new, unforgiving administration. Our investigation into the private correspondence of the league reveals that Eddie Johnson was called into a closed-door meeting where the terms were laid out in no uncertain terms. According to insiders who spoke to major sports outlets years later, the commissioner personally delivered an ultimatum that would haunt the guard for the rest of his days. He was told that one more slip, one more failed screening for prohibited substances would result in the ultimate punishment. The documentary bits from this period show a league that was no longer interested in rehabilitation stories. They wanted results. For Eddie Johnson, the pressure was at an all-time high, with a career worth millions of dollars hanging by a single, fragile thread. The Golden Boy was now a marked man, and the clock was ticking louder than ever before. This leads us to a moment of intense suspicion. Did the league office already have the evidence they needed? Records suggest that by the spring of 1987, the surveillance on his private life had reached an unprecedented level. The commissioner had set a trap that was impossible to escape, and on a specific afternoon in May, he finally decided to spring it, leading to a confrontation that would effectively erase Eddie Johnson from the history of the game. The date was Friday, May 15, 1987, a day that would forever be etched in the annals of sporting infamy. It was the day the league finally pulled the plug. In an official decision that sent shockwaves through every locker room in the country, the NBA announced that Eddie Johnson was being banned for life. He was the first player in history to receive such a permanent and devastating sentence for repeated violations of the league's conduct policies regarding prohibited substances. The headline in the New York Times on May 16, 1987, captured the gravity of the situation, stating that the Fast Eddie era was over, not with a championship trophy, but with a gavel. The documentary evidence shows that the league wanted to make an example out of him, using his downfall to signal a new, sober era for the sport. As we look at the reports from the national press at the time, the reaction was a mixture of horror and grim validation. To the public, it seemed like a necessary cleansing of the game, but for Eddie Johnson, it was a professional execution. The investigative files from the commissioner's office detailed a pattern of behavior that left them with no other choice, citing multiple failed opportunities to change his path. He wasn't just losing his job, he was losing his identity, his income, and the only world he had ever known. The lifetime ban meant he couldn't play, he couldn't coach, and he couldn't even represent the league in any official capacity. In a single afternoon, a man who had earned millions and played in front of sold-out crowds was cast into the wilderness. But as the lights went out on his NBA career, a much more dangerous journey was beginning on the streets. The most haunting part of this Black Friday was the realization that, without the structure of the team and the eyes of the coaches, Eddie Johnson was now completely alone. And it was in this isolation that he would encounter a financial crisis so severe that it would force him into the arms of the very criminal elements he had once tried to outrun. When the cheering stops and the bank accounts start to run dry, the reality of a fallen star becomes a cold and lonely place. Following his lifetime ban in 1987, Eddie Johnson's life spiraled into a level of chaos that few could survive. According to the bailiff's records and foreclosure documents from the late 80s, the once wealthy athlete was suddenly drowning in a sea of red ink. The millions he had earned during his peak years in Atlanta had vanished, replaced by a mountain of debt that exceeded the value of all his remaining assets. Without the massive paychecks from the league, the taxes on a luxurious life became an unbearable weight. Investigative reports from local media in Georgia described a man who was frequently seen in the company of low-level street operators, a far cry from the high society circles he once frequented. The first official arrest after his ban occurred in a quiet neighborhood, and the details found in the Fulton County Police records paint a heartbreaking picture of his decline. The charges were no longer about conduct detrimental to the league. They were about survival and the desperate need to feed a habit that had taken total control of his soul. As the documentary bits from his mounting legal troubles show, he was moving through a revolving door of precinct offices and holding cells. Why did a man with his intelligence and talent let it go this far? Friends from his past, interviewed in various retrospective documentaries, claimed that the depression of losing his career made him stop caring about the consequences of his actions. He was a ghost of his former self, wandering the streets of a city that had once treated him like a king. But the most disturbing part of this chapter isn't just the loss of money. It's the loss of his moral compass. By the early 90s, the Fast Eddie who had dazzled fans was replaced by a man whose name appeared in the police blotter more often than in the sports section. The investigation into his post-career years reveals that he was facing a court date that would finally determine if he would spend the rest of his life as a free man or a number in the state system. The story of Eddie Johnson in the years following his expulsion from the league reads less like a sports biography and more like a never-ending police blotter. For over 20 years, the man who once outshone the brightest lights of professional basketball became a permanent fixture in the legal systems of the Southeast. According to a detailed registry of his decline, which is supported by public records from various jurisdictions, Eddie Johnson was taken into custody more than 100 times between the late 80s and the mid-2000s. This staggering number of run-ins with the law is a documentary beat that paints a picture of a life completely untethered from reality. The charges ranged from petty shoplifting in local markets to more serious incidents of robbery, each one a small puncture in the legacy of a former all-star. In reports from the police departments of the era, officers often noted that the disheveled man they were booking into the system bore no resemblance to the athlete who had once graced the cover of magazines. The investigation into these lost decades reveals a man who was essentially a ghost in his own city. He was moving through a revolving door of county jails, often appearing in court for crimes that suggested a desperate need to fund his forbidden habits. In several newspaper archives from the 90s, it was reported that he had sold off almost every piece of his former life, from his luxury cars to the very trophies that symbolized his greatness. But the most chilling investigative anchor of this period is the sheer anonymity of his fall. While the sports world moved on to new heroes, Eddie Johnson was becoming a cautionary tale whispered in the corridors of justice. He was a man who had everything and threw it away, one arrest at a time, until he reached a point where the system no longer saw a basketball player, but a habitual offender who was a danger to the community. But even as his registry of decline grew to an impossible length, the worst was still to come. The public thought they had seen the bottom of the spiral until a specific afternoon in 2008, when a new set of documents surfaced, detailing a crime so horrific that it would strip away the last shred of sympathy anyone had left for the former star. The year 2008 will forever be remembered as the moment the name Eddie Johnson became synonymous with a darkness that no amount of sporting glory could ever mask. On a humid afternoon in Florida, the man who was once the pride of the Atlanta Hawks was taken into custody for an offense that shocked even the most cynical investigators. According to the official criminal case materials from the state of Florida, the charges were not related to his usual patterns of theft or public disturbance. This time, the accusation was an unforgivable transgression against a minor. The documents filed in the court of Lake County detailed an encounter involving an 8-year-old victim, a figure that was recorded in the trial transcripts with chilling precision. This wasn't just another slip-up. It was a total moral collapse that left the community in a state of absolute fury. Public reaction to the news was swift and merciless. Even those fans who had held on to a sliver of hope for his redemption found themselves unable to defend him. In various investigative reports from major Florida news outlets at the time, the details of the incident suggested a man who had completely lost any sense of boundary or decency. The documentary bits from the police interviews conducted after the incident describe a defendant who seemed almost detached from the gravity of his actions. How does a two-time All-Star go from the heights of the Omni Coliseum to being the subject of such a disturbing criminal investigation? The anchors of this chapter are the formal statements from the prosecutor's office, which outlined a pattern of behavior that they argued made Eddie Johnson a predator who could no longer be allowed to walk the streets. The world of sports had banned him for life years ago, but now the state of Florida was preparing to do the same, and the stakes were higher than any game he had ever played. As the evidence was gathered and the trial date was set, it became clear that the former star was facing a legal battle that he couldn't win with speed or charm. The courtroom was about to become the final arena for Eddie Johnson, and the prize wasn't a championship ring, but the remaining years of his existence. When Eddie Johnson walked into the courtroom in Lake County to hear his judgment, the atmosphere was thick with a sense of grim finality. This was no longer a spectacle for the fans. It was a reckoning for a man who had exhausted every ounce of grace the world had to offer. According to the official court records from the day of the verdict, the evidence presented against him was overwhelming. The documentary beats of the trial included testimony that painted a picture of a fallen icon who had become a menace to the most vulnerable members of society. When it came time for the judge to speak, the words used were as sharp as a knife. In a quote that was later widely circulated in the media, the presiding judge stated that Eddie Johnson had forfeited his right to live among the individuals he had so callously betrayed. The final verdict was as heavy as the steel doors that would soon close behind him. 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of a supervised release. The date of this pronouncement in the Lake County Court serves as the ultimate investigative anchor, marking the official end of Eddie Johnson's existence as a free man. For a player whose entire identity was built on speed and the ability to move without restriction, the prospect of spending the rest of his days in a confined space was the ultimate irony. Reports from the courtroom noted that he remained largely expressionless as the sentence was read, a man who seemed to have already accepted that his journey had reached its final dark destination. There would be no more appeals to the league office, no more chances at rehabilitation, and no more fresh starts in new cities. The man they called Fast Eddie had finally run out of road. But as he was led away in shackles to begin his term in a maximum security facility, a new question began to circulate among those who followed his tragic trajectory. Was this the inevitable conclusion of a path started in the smoky clubs of Atlanta decades ago? Or was there something even deeper in the shadows of his life that had yet to be revealed? Behind the walls of the prison, the legend of the basketball star was replaced by a grim reality that would last for 12 more years. The transition from the roar of a stadium to the heavy, echoing silence of a maximum security cell is a psychological trauma that few can truly comprehend. For Eddie Johnson, the Santa Rosa Correctional Institution in Florida became the final arena of his life, a place where his fame meant absolutely nothing to the guards or the other men in orange jumpsuits. According to the internal records of the correctional facility, the former All-Star spent 12 years within those concrete walls, a period of time that was largely erased from the public consciousness. The investigation into his years behind bars reveals a man who was often described as a ghostly presence in the prison yard. Journalists who managed to gain rare access to the site noted that he rarely spoke of his time in the league, as if the memory of 1980 was too painful to revisit. The documentary bits from his prison file suggest that his health began to decline almost immediately upon his arrival. Without the high-end medical care and the strict physical regimen of a professional athlete, the Fast Eddie, who once outran everyone, was now struggling just to walk across the cafeteria. In several reports from the correctional facility's medical staff, it was noted that his years of struggling with prohibited substances had left his body a shell of its former self. He had traded the luxury of five-star hotels for a thin mattress and a shared sink. Why did he never reach out for a final interview to clear his name? Some believe he was too ashamed, while others suggest he had simply lost the will to be anything other than a number. The anchors of this chapter are the official visitation logs, which show a man who was increasingly isolated from the world that once worshipped him. But even in the depths of his confinement, Eddie Johnson remained a figure of mystery. While the public had largely forgotten him, his presence in the system was a constant reminder of how far a person can fall. And as the years turned into a decade, the man who was once the fastest thing on two legs began to prepare for a final exit that would be as quiet and unnoticed as his arrival in prison had been loud and scandalous. The end of the story for Eddie Johnson did not come with a dramatic final shot or a standing ovation. It came in the sterile, lonely environment of a prison infirmary. On October 26, 2020, the man who had once been the heartbeat of Atlanta basketball concluded his life's journey. What is truly shocking about this investigative anchor is that the news didn't break for weeks. In a world preoccupied with a global health crisis, the passing of a disgraced former star was barely a blip on the radar. The official record from the medical examiner's office in Florida stated that he succumbed to a prolonged illness, a vague term that often hides the brutal reality of a body worn down by decades of neglect and the consequences of toxic habits. The documentary bits surrounding his final days are shrouded in a strange, almost eerie silence. It took until mid-November for major sports outlets to even confirm that he was no longer with us. The investigative question here is heartbreaking. How does a man who was once the 4th overall pick in the draft end up in a situation where his departure is not even noticed by the league for nearly a month. Public materials from that time show that the NBA issued no formal statement, no moment of silence was held, and no tributes were broadcast. It was as if the league had already decided years ago that Eddie Johnson was a chapter they wanted to stay closed forever. The date of October 26, 2020, stands as a cold, hard fact that marks the final point on a timeline that began with so much promise in 1977. As the details of his passing slowly trickled out, the reaction from the basketball community was one of muted reflection. Some recalled his brilliance on the floor, while others could only think of the crimes that had defined his later years. But even in his final hour, there was one more strange twist to his story, a confusion that had plagued him for years and continued even after he had left this world behind. One of the most bizarre and frustrating aspects of this entire investigation is the identity theft of reputation that occurred because of a simple name. For decades, the fast Eddie Johnson of the Atlanta Hawks was frequently confused with another Eddie Johnson, a celebrated shooter who played for the Phoenix Suns. This wasn't just a minor annoyance, it was a curse that haunted both men. Public archives from the 80s and 90s show numerous instances where major media outlets accidentally used the wrong photo or attributed the bad Eddie's legal troubles to the good Eddie. This confusion reached a fever pitch after the Lifetime ban in 1987, causing immense distress to a man who had done nothing but play the game with integrity. The documentary bits from this strange side story include a famous interview where the other Eddie Johnson spoke about the constant phone calls and accusations he received from confused fans. He once stated that having the same name as the league's most notorious figure was like carrying around someone else's shadow. Even when the Atlanta Star was sentenced to life in prison in 2008, the confusion persisted, with some internet forums and local news stations initially reporting the wrong man's biography. The anchors of this chapter are the archived retractions from sports magazines that had to apologize for linking the Phoenix Suns star to the horrific crimes committed in Florida. It is a tragic irony that even as Eddie Johnson was losing his freedom, he was also inadvertently damaging the name of a man who shared his identity. This leads us to a disturbing thought about the nature of fame. Can a name ever be truly redeemed once it has been dragged through the mud of such high-profile scandals? For the Eddie Johnson who spent his final 12 years in a cell, the name was a burden he could never escape. For the world, the name became a riddle that required a careful investigation to solve. And as we look back at the 1980s, we realize that this confusion was just one more layer of the tragedy that surrounded the man who could never find his way back to the light. To truly understand the fall of Eddie Johnson, we must look at the world that surrounded him. The 1980s were a dark and turbulent era for the league, a time when the glitter of the disco lights often hid a rotting core. This wasn't just about one man, it was about an entire generation of athletes who were caught in a storm of temptation. According to historical statistics from the decade between 1980 and 1990, a staggering number of players saw their professional journeys cut short, or their lives concluded prematurely due to their involvement with forbidden substances. The documentary beats of this era are found in the archives of the book titled The Gold Standard, which describes a league in a state of absolute panic, struggling to maintain its public image while its stars were collapsing in locker rooms and hotel suites. Eddie Johnson was not the only casualty, but he became the most haunting example of the league's zero-tolerance solution. While the tragedy of Len Bias in 1986 is often cited as the catalyst for change, the slow, decade-long disintegration of Eddie Johnson provided the investigative anchors that the commissioner needed to justify a total crackdown. Public materials from the time suggest that the NBA was terrified of losing its television contracts if it didn't clean house. In the reports of sports historians, this period is often described as a war for the soul of the game, where players were seen less as human beings in need of help and more as liabilities to be managed or discarded. The investigation into the league's internal memos from the mid-'80s reveals a desperate scramble to implement testing protocols that would eventually trap Fast Eddie in a web from which he could never escape. The question remains, was he a victim of the times, or was he the architect of his own ruin? As the 1980s drew to a close, the league had successfully branded him as the face of the problem, but in doing so, they may have ignored the deeper systemic issues that allowed such a tragedy to occur in the first place. But while his reputation was being dismantled by the press, his actual performance on the court left behind a set of numbers that even his harshest critics couldn't ignore. What is left of a man when the headlines fade and the prison doors lock for the final time? If you look at the historical record books of the Atlanta Hawks today, you will find the name of Eddie Johnson etched into the very foundation of the franchise. Despite the scandal and the shame, the investigative anchors of his career are still there for everyone to see. According to the official team statistics, he remains ranked among the top 10 in several key categories, including career steals and points per game for guards of his era. In his 552 games in the league, he displayed a level of talent that, if nurtured differently, could have led him to the Hall of Fame. But today, those records are often accompanied by a silent asterisk, a reminder of a career that was professionally concluded far too soon. There is a strange and almost macabre afterlife for his legacy in the world of sports memorabilia. Data from recent online auction platforms show that the value of his 1981 Topps basketball card has seen a surprising surge in recent years. While a standard card might be worth very little, mint-condition versions of Eddie Johnson's early cards have been known to sell for several $100s to collectors who are fascinated by the forbidden nature of his story. It is a haunting reality. His memory is kept alive, not by his triumphs, but by the darkness that followed them. In the archives of sports collectibles, he is treated as a renegade figure, a man whose physical gifts were as immense as his failures. The total sum of his career earnings, which once reached into the millions, stands in stark contrast to the final value of his estate at the time his journey concluded. But as we look at the jerseys hanging in the rafters of the modern arenas, we have to ask why his number was never even considered for retirement. Was it because of the crimes, or was there something else? A lingering fear that mentioning his name would bring back the ghosts of an era the league wants to forget? This leads us to the most controversial part of our investigation, involving whispers from those who were actually in the room when the decisions were made. Even decades later, the name Eddie Johnson causes a shift in the tone of conversation among the veterans of the Atlanta Hawks. There are those who believe that the Fast Eddie we saw in the news was merely a character created to protect more influential figures. In several unofficial interviews with former teammates that have surfaced in specialized sports archives, there are mentions of strange phone calls that Eddie received in the weeks leading up to his lifetime ban in 1987. These documentary bits suggest that there may have been unrecorded meetings between the Star Guard and certain influential individuals from the Atlanta underworld who had an interest in the outcome of certain games. Was he targeted by the league because he knew too much? The investigative anchors for this theory are found in the fragmented reports of journalists who covered the Atlanta crime beat in the late 80s. They noted that Eddie Johnson often frequented establishments owned by individuals who were under federal investigation. Some researchers have suggested that the league office was tipped off not just about his forbidden habits, but about his associations that threatened the very integrity of the sport. The theory posits that the lifetime ban was a preemptive strike to remove a man who had become a liability to the NBA's gambling policies. While there is no formal document that confirms a direct conspiracy, the strange timing of his final suspension continues to be a topic of heated debate in the backrooms of old sports bars in Georgia. Did Eddie Johnson take secrets with him to the Santa Rosa prison? In his final years, he reportedly spoke to a fellow inmate about the people who really ran the show in '84. This investigative question hangs over his legacy like a heavy fog. If he was indeed a scapegoat, it would mean that his entire downfall was orchestrated to save the image of a billion-dollar industry. But regardless of the whispers, the human cost was all too real, and the impact on those he left behind would prove to be the most painful chapter of all. When we look back at the chaos of the 1980s, it is easy to judge Eddie Johnson as a man of weak character. But modern sports science offers a far more complex and haunting perspective on what was really happening inside the mind of the man they called Fast Eddie. According to recent archives from the National Institute on Drug Abuse and various sports psychology journals, many elite athletes of that era suffered from undiagnosed conditions that made them uniquely vulnerable to the allure of prohibited substances. The investigation reveals that the high-speed lifestyle Eddie Johnson craved wasn't just a choice, it was a symptom of a brain wired for constant stimulation. In the 1980s, the league's solution was a hammer, but today's experts argue that a scalpel was needed. The documentary bits found in his later prison letters describe a man who was haunted by his own biology. He wrote about the noise in his head that only silenced when he was either on the court or under the influence of his illicit habits. The investigative anchors of this chapter are found in the comparison between the 1983 drug agreement and the modern NBA Mental Health and Wellness Program established in 2018. While the old rules focus strictly on punishment, the current protocols recognize the psychological preconditions that lead to a star's collapse. Public materials from neurological studies of former players suggest that the very traits that made Eddie Johnson a two-time All-Star, his hyper-reactivity and fearlessness, were the same traits that guaranteed his professional destruction when left unmanaged. We have to ask, if Eddie Johnson were playing in the year 2026, would he be a Hall of Famer instead of a cautionary tale? In the archives of the Florida Correctional System, there is a mention of a clinical evaluation that hinted at severe impulse control issues that had been present since his university days at Auburn. This leads us to a disturbing realization. The league was cheering for a man who was essentially a ticking time bomb. But while the scientists analyze his brain, the hearts of those closest to him were being broken in ways that no clinical report could ever capture, leading to a domestic drama that was kept out of the bright lights of the arena. While Eddie Johnson was making headlines for his speed on the court and his scandals in the streets, there was a group of people whose lives were being quietly dismantled in his wake. The investigation into his private life reveals a trail of broken promises and legal filings that paint a devastating picture of his role as a family man. According to public records from a 1995 family court filing in Florida, the former star was struggling to meet even the most basic obligations to his dependents. The documentary bits from these files show a man who had earned millions of dollars but was unable to provide a stable environment for those who carried his name. For his children, the name Johnson wasn't a badge of honor. It was a heavy public cross that they were forced to carry through school hallways and local neighborhoods. In a rare and heartbreaking quote found in the archives of a small Florida news outlet from the late 90s, a close relative described the experience of watching him fall as witnessing a slow-motion car crash that never ends. They spoke of the man they knew before the millions, the boy from Florida who was full of life and potential, and how he had been replaced by a stranger who was consumed by his own demons. The investigative anchors of this chapter are the recorded testimonies from family members during his various legal hearings, where they pleaded for the court to see the man behind the addict. They weren't just fighting for his freedom, they were fighting for the memory of the person he used to be. The records show that by the time of his 2008 arrest, many of his closest kin had been forced to distance themselves for their own survival. How does a family recover from the public shame of a patriarch who was once a hero but ended his journey as a convicted offender? The psychological weight of his legacy continues to ripple through the lives of his descendants today. His life became the ultimate warning, a ghost story told to every young man who thinks $1 million makes him invincible. And as we look at the wreckage of his personal life, we see that the true cost of his fast life wasn't just paid in courtrooms, but in the silence of family reunions where his chair remained empty for decades. The tragedy of Eddie Johnson was not in vain, but the price of the lesson was astronomical. His total collapse served as the catalyst for a systemic revolution in how professional sports leagues protect their young assets. According to official league history, the NBA Rookie Transition Program, which was formally established in 1986, was heavily influenced by the growing epidemic that claimed players like Johnson. The investigation shows that the league realized they couldn't just hand a 22-year-old a check for several $100,000 and expect him to navigate the sharks of the city alone. Today, every new player is subjected to intensive seminars that use the Fast Eddie timeline as a literal map of what not to do. The documentary bits for this chapter are found in the fine print of the modern uniform player contract. Specifically, paragraph 14 regarding moral conduct and prohibited activities has been tightened to a degree that would have made Eddie Johnson's lifestyle impossible to maintain for even a single week. The investigative anchors are the millions of dollars now funneled into the NBA's Player Assistance Fund, a direct response to the era when stars like Johnson were simply discarded once they were no longer useful to the box office. Public materials from the league's headquarters suggest that the Eddie Johnson case is still studied by executives as a reminder of the liability that comes with ignoring the personal health of the players. He became the scary example that saved the careers of hundreds of men who came after him. The total sum of his 552 games in the league stands as a testament to what was lost, while the current stability of the league stands as a testament to what was learned. After the lessons were learned and the rules were rewritten, we are left with one final question that the records and the statistics can't answer. When the lights finally go out and the crowd goes home, who is left to remember the man who could outrun the wind but couldn't escape the shadow of his own choices? As we reach the final seconds of this investigation, we are forced to look at the total sum of a life that was both a masterpiece and a catastrophe. Eddie Johnson concluded his journey in 2020, leaving behind a legacy that is as divided as the man himself. According to the final records from the league and the correctional system, he appeared in exactly 552 games in the professional league, a number that represents both his immense talent and the tragic brevity of his stay at the top. The investigative anchors of this final chapter reveal a staggering contrast that should serve as a warning to every young athlete today. In the end, the total amount of his career earnings, once estimated to be in the millions, stood at zero, eclipsed by a mountain of legal debts and fines that could never be repaid. He traded the roar of a stadium for the silence of a prison ward, proving that even the fastest man on the court cannot outrun the consequences of his choices. The documentary bits from his final days in Florida suggest that he was a man who had become a stranger to his own glory. While the world remembers the two-time All-Star who could change the direction of a game in a heartbeat, the official papers from the Santa Rosa facility describe only an aging inmate with a failing heart. Why did a man who had everything lose it all so completely? Was it the pressure of the 1980s? The lack of support from a league that was still learning how to handle its stars, or a deep-seated darkness within the man himself? In the archives of the Atlanta Hawks, his points and steals remain, but his name is spoken in whispers, a ghost that the team would rather keep in the shadows. The investigation into the life of Eddie Johnson leaves us with a chilling realization. Talent is a gift, but character is the only thing that keeps you from falling. So, as we close the file on Fast Eddie, we are left with one final haunting question that no statistic can answer. Who was truly responsible for the destruction of this icon? Was it the white powder that clouded his judgment, the legal system that eventually locked him away for life, or a society that celebrated his speed while ignoring his soul? Eddie Johnson is gone now, buried in a quiet corner of Florida, but his story remains as a permanent stain and a permanent lesson. He was a man who reached for the stars and fell into an abyss. And today, as we look back at those 552 games, we have to wonder if anyone could have saved the man who refused to save himself. The truth about Eddie Johnson is that he didn't just lose his career. He lost his way, and the world is still trying to understand why.